All right, so far at this point, and I know every class I kind of recap this a little bit, but I just want to make sure we kind of get a feel for where we should be at. And so last time we did this one, we called it the DOM in detail, where we didn't get too much into the DOM as much as I was expecting to, but we did build the guessing game where we interacted with the console a little bit. We dug in and looked at some properties in there. And the idea of the guessing game was to sort of help bring things together, right? We used a switch statement, we used an if statement. We didn't use any loops, but we used variables, all the basics of just programming in general. And so today with the tic-tac-toe, it's the same kind of thing. It's just sort of seeing it again. Today we will spend a little bit more time doing some CSS though, to style up the board a little bit, the tic-tac-toe board. And then we'll dive into making it interactive and playing the game and everything, all right? It's going to be a two-part lecture. Part 2 will be on Tuesday next week. And then a friendly reminder, a week from today is Thanksgiving, so no class. We just have one class next week. And in fact, that class next week is our last JavaScript class. Then we move on to Bootstrap after the Thanksgiving break. All right, so let's take a look at the actual assignment here, what's required. And I opened up the lecture, and I meant to open up that. So here's what we're looking for. We're going to create an HTML page that displays a tic-tac-toe grid, right? We're just going to do that with plain old HTML CSS. We're going to ask for 2 usernames using prompts, or I'll allow prompts, but it'd be nice if you use the HTML web form to get their names, right? But a prompt is fine. So 2 prompts. Then you'll display a message on the home page that says it's Joe's turn or whatever. Joe takes a turn, he clicks on one of the squares, and it'll mark it with an X or an O, right? And then you'll display a message now that says it's player 2's turn or Sue's turn or whatever. And then when she makes her turn, it'll put an O there. You continue doing that till there's a winner. Then you display a message that says so-and-so won, Beavis won, Butthead won. Then the play again button will appear. And a couple notes here, when they click on a square, they shouldn't be able to click on it again, right? Once you click an X on there, you can't let the other guy click an O on it, right? Okay. And all messages need to be displayed in the document, not in a pop-up box. So when it says Joe won, we don't want an alert box. We want a thing on the actual web page that says Joe won or whatever, right? And then we're going to go over the win code together in class on Tuesday next week. But we're going to get a good chunk of it built today. And the rest of this is all about submission and file structure and all that stuff. So let's go ahead and get a project going here. Just opening up my little template. And I'll just copy and paste that. And we'll call it tic-tac-toe PM. All right. And I'm going to open up all 3 of the main files, the index file, the JavaScript file, and the CSS file. And again, I am recording this, so if you don't want to follow along or you can't keep up or whatever, that's okay. Also, keep in mind that this is a homework assignment, right? And so the last thing I want is to see a whole bunch of submissions that they just upload my code, right? We don't want that. We want you guys to make this nice and make it all your own and everything, okay? All right, so tic-tac-toe. The very first thing, we did this the other day with the guessing game, is as humans, we have to think through this. So turn off our programmer brain for a minute, and let's just think kind of what needs to be done based on the instructions that we just read. What kind of stuff do we need? What do we care about? Let's make some comments here. What do we think?
Needs to be a board.
Okay, we need to make a game board, so make the game board. Good. What else? Yeah, so we need to get player names or something like that, right? Or just go with players. That's easy enough. What else? There's a couple things more.
Score?
Yeah, we need to, no, when you say score, do you mean how many times Bob won kind of a thing, or what do you mean by score?
Sure.
Okay, so scoreboard. That's not a requirement, but that'd be a good extra mile thing. Okay, what else? Yeah, like controlling or managing the turns, managing whose turn it is. Okay.
Need a game board.
That's the first one up there. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, the markers, the X's and O's, right? Yeah, so the game markers or tokens or whatever you want to call them, right? Okay. So there's really one more, well, 2 more things. that I can think of.
The logic,
The logic for,
clicking like the in a row.
yeah, so the win code, right? To check for win, yeah, exactly.
Logic or whatever it's called.
Yeah, the win code logic or whatever. Yeah, or checking for wins or whatever. And then there's one other thing. Remember, we're supposed to display whose turn it is and all that stuff, so maybe something that, manage the display or something like that, okay? Now, some of those things, as we're coding along, they'll end up being 2 or 3, those will be kind of the same thing, and we'll just delete the node or whatever, but it gives us a good starting point. So let's start with the easy part, which is making the board, and we can do that in HTML, super easy. Any thoughts on how we would make a board in HTML?
It's gotta be 9 spaces, you know?
So 9 spaces, what would we use to make the spaces? Table, divs, right, both are good, yeah. What else? If they're divs, what kind of things could we do with the div? We could use Flexbox, we could use the grid, right? We could use lots of different things, right? We're just gonna go with some old school divs and floats, right? Just some pretty simple stuff. All right, so let's start off. Now, I've coded this game like a couple dozen times at this point. Every semester I code it for every class, and I usually have 2 classes per semester. And I've been teaching this for a couple of years now, so I already know some of the CSS problems we're gonna run into. So I'm gonna sort of preemptively strike on those and deal with it in the HTML right now. So just keep that in mind, and I'll show you kind of some of the things that we'll be dealing with. But one thing I want to do is I want the board to be inside of one div. Like there's just going to be one div that has the whole board inside of it. So we're going to go div, and in fact I'm going to call this like ID equals game board. Okay, so inside of that, I'm going to ask you a question here. Would you agree that that is a tic-tac-toe board? Do you guys see it? Right, potentially, right? That's the shape and everything. It's just a 3x3 set of squares or divs or whatever. Now, if I looked at that page, what would we see? Nothing, right? Because there's no style on it, there's no text or anything. So we'll deal with the style in a minute. One other thing, though, and this is just from experience programming this up, but all of you, if you programmed this, you would discover this when you got to your CSS. I want each one of those rows to have another div around it so that I can more easily target rows at a time if I need to. And that's something that we would have kind of run into when we got into the CSS. So I'm just going to add a row in front of each one of these. Div, and I'm going to call it ID equals row dash 1, 2, 3, right? And then we'll close that out over here. Okay, so this is row 1, 2, and 3. That's just something that, just from experience building this particular page, I've run into. This will help making some of our targeting a little easier. But that's it. That's the game board in the HTML. Now let's make it look like a game board, because as we pointed out, that there's nothing there, right? All right. So let's just go in here real quick. And right off the bat, we're going to see that if I want to get a hold of these guys right here, they are the children of the row IDs, right? These 3 that I have highlighted, they're the child of row 1. These are the child of row 2 and row 3. Well, with one of our advanced CSS selectors, I can do this little trick. Give me all the divs where the ID starts with row dash, right? That gives me row 1, 2, and 3. And then I could target all the divs that are inside of that, right? So that targets all 9 of those divs. Did everybody see that? Okay. So with those, we'll just do a couple simple styles. We'll do a border, 2 pixels, solid plum, it's a purplish, dark purple color, and we'll do height, 200 pixels, and width, 200 pixels. And that'll be good for the moment. What do you expect to see when I refresh?
You will see something, it'll change.
I set them to 200 pixels each.
Obviously, just a row of,
They'll all be blocked.
just be a row of them, right?
Close. They'll be squares, right?
Would be all on the left side.
They'll be vertically aligned, stacked on top of each other. Exactly right. And we'll talk about why that is. So there we go. Purple. That is really faint there. Let me make like a 5 pixel. Ooh, nice. All right. Why are those borders in between thicker? Yeah, it's top and bottom borders smushed together, which we're going to leave that alone. It's fine. Okay, so the reason they're stacked vertically, this will make it sort of obvious here. If I get rid of the width right there, remember, what's the default display of a div? It's block style, right? Block level display. And so that div takes up the whole width right there. Well, when I put a width on it, it still takes up the whole width. It still, let's say it this way, it still owns the whole width, but it's only using 200 pixels of it, right? So we wanted to not do that, right? So what could we do? What are some options? Lots of different ways. Float left, what else? Inline block, yeah. Any other thoughts? We can use the grid, yeah. Flexbox, right? There's a ton of different options here. Let's play around with a couple of them. If we change these to inline block, that may be all we need to do. I still want to show you the floating version. Yeah. So I want to show you the floating version too. Now notice here the little gap in between. That gap in between comes from the fact that these are now inline components. They're inline components, which means now we have that weird white space problem in HTML we've talked about, because they're inline components. If we left them as floated them, we wouldn't have that problem. So this is a fine solution. We could leave it like that. If you want to go that route, that's totally fine. Or we could do this. Let's go ahead and float them. Now, what do you expect to see when I refresh that? I just floated them all left. The white space will disappear? Well, and Weston, I think you had that idea there. Yeah, it's going to be one big row, right? Yeah. Why is that? Yeah, so this is a tricky little thing here, and I'm going to show you what's happening here. This guy right here, this, and this, right, row 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to put colors on those, borders on those, I meant. So div row -1, and we'll say border 3 pixels solid red, and we'll do number 2 and number 3, and we'll make that one black and green. I think those are contrasting enough. Now, watch when I refresh, watch what happens to the page. All those things are crammed up there at the top, right? They're collapsed. So to solve the collapse, I'll show you. Overflow is one way to deal with this, which we're going to do something different, but I just want to make sure we understand what's going on here. So this kind of solves the problem, right? But we're going to take a little bit different approach in a second. But you can see that there's the red for row 1 and the black for row 2 and the green for row 3. But when that overflow property is not turned on or not set to hidden, those collapse. The reason they collapse is because there's no content. Content is what expands divs unless you give them a specific set height. Now, these divs, the parent divs that are collapsed, you may argue, well, they do have content. They got 3 divs inside of them, right? Those 3 divs are not content. They're just structure. There's no content in there. So what's happening there, because those things are collapsed, they're kind of being ignored, and so it seems like just all 9 of those blocks are just floating against each other. So how could I deal with that, other than the overflow thing we just did? What's another way to deal with that? What's that?
Put content in there.
You could put content in there, but I don't know what content we would want, right? We could, but we want to just sort of have a board here.
Clear the float.
Clear the float, yeah. So where would I want to clear it? Well, what's happening here is I'm starting the very first time I called float is right here. And then these are floating. And then this piece, because of the weird collapse and everything and the way floats work, this one's getting kind of squished up, and so these are kind of floating up there. You'll even see there's this weird little step right here. Can you see that? Right there? That little weird step. It's all has to do with the way float works and the weird collapsing border. So I want to clear it on each row. I don't want to clear it on these guys. I just want to clear it on row 1, on row 2, on row 3. But I want it to continue to being on each of those rows' children. That's easy. I can just do it right here. Clear both, or clear left, whatever. Okay, so let's run that and look what happens. And now it's cleared. All right, now, and then notice the borders are still collapsed on the parent. Okay, arguably that's a bad thing, or arguably it doesn't matter in the context of this program, either way, okay, or this page. Now, what's happening here? Row 1 is being cleared, not row 1's child, but row 1. So right off the bat, the very first thing we do is we clear the float on row 1. There isn't even a float on there. Doesn't matter, we clear it just in case, right? Then we apply on this line right here, we apply the float right there on this, and this, and this. And then we clear the float on row 2. So the float stops, and then we reapply it on these 3 guys. Then we clear the float here, and then it starts again on these 3 guys. And then we're done, okay? All right, so any questions about that idea there? Anyway, there's lots of ways you could deal with this. There's, again, if you use the grid or Flexbox, we'd have a whole different set of CSS here. Last thing is we don't need that border anymore, right? So we can get rid of that. Also, do we have to have this 3 times? No, I could just use this target right here, right? That targets row 1, row 2, and row 3. See? Same thing. Okay? So that's something that just came with experience of doing this a couple times.
Did you just apply clear above the first thing you did? Just block down here?
Where at? Down here?
Yeah. You just apply clear above.
Well, then it would clear it on all the inside divs.
Oh, sorry. I just-
Yeah, yeah. Yep, that's okay. All right, so let's go back to here. There we go. Yeah, so in this first one, on line 4, we're clearing it just on the rows. Line 5, we're applying the float to the children of the rows. All right, so again, playing around with the CSS over time, I've just discovered some of these little things that are making it a little bit easier. All right, let's take a look how this appears now. Got this nice purple grid here. I want to center that though, right? Now, you may not want to center yours. You may want to, depending on what you're going to do with yours, but I want to center mine just for now, because I want to show you a different problem we're going to run into. So let's look at the parent here, game board, right? Inside of here, we're going to style, there we go, oops, div game board, and we're going to just put a border, 2 pixels solid blue, and we're going to have a collapse, overflow problem again, right? An overflow problem. So we fix that real quick. Overflow hidden. Okay. Now, what I want to do is I want to center that set of 9 divs inside or on the page somehow, right? What kind of options do you guys see for centering that? I'll give you a hint. Probably everything we think of is not going to work. But go ahead.
Like I would put a flex on the body.
Okay.
To space around.
All right. So flex on right here. So
Not on the game, on like the whole body.
oh, on the whole body.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then do just like on.
So display like this, flex, and then justify content.
Yeah.
Justify content center, right? Yeah.
That might work. I would do space around.
Oh, space around. Okay, we'll do that. Space around. So what's that going to apply to? What things just became flex items when we applied that to the body? The game board. Yeah. There you go. Nice. So I was off by 1. I said most of the ideas you come up with won't work. Turns out 100% of them worked, right? Most of the time, what people forget about Flexbox, so I'm glad that you remembered that. It's very good. Most of the time what happens is we try things like text align and margin auto and stuff like that. And so this is a really nice, good solution for that. Let me show you, though. I do want to show you what problem you'll run into if you try to do the margin auto trick, okay? But we're going to keep this method. because it's nice and clean. But for the moment, I'm gonna just get rid of that piece right there just for a moment. And we're back to this. Now, if I try to apply to the game board text align, why does that not work? It does not work. What's that? It's not text, and what'll happen there is if there is text in the fields, in the divs, that'll be centered, right? So we want to center text, we use that. If we want to center the content that's inside of something, that can also work. But in this case, because we're dealing with float, and there's all kinds of weirdness that happens when you're dealing with float. If this were just a box, like a big square box that was, 600 by 600 or whatever, that text align trick would have worked. We saw that when we did the Photoshop to code with that video in the center. That actually made that work. But in this case, you might think, okay, that doesn't work. So let's do, margin 20 pixels auto, right? That also doesn't work. Actually, technically it did work, but it doesn't center. Why doesn't it center?
It's already edge to edge, and it needs to move what's inside.
Yeah, exactly. It actually technically is centered, right? Because we're talking about the blue box here on the outside, and it's centered. It's taking up the whole width, and it's centered. The moment I shrink that box, it'll shift over, right? So if we say like width is like 1,000 or something, save, refresh. See, now the whole box centered. So it'd just be a matter of shrinking that box down to the same width as those tic-tac-toe grids, which is 605 pixels, right? And I'm gonna quickly set everything to box sizing, border box. I should keep that as in my template. I keep forgetting to do that. Border box. All right, and this, if I put this at, I believe 605, and I'm going to turn off this game border here. And there we go. That's basically the effect we're looking for. But I like Canon solution better. Get rid of that. And we had it here. Let's go ahead and move this down so we have a little more space. And get rid of that extra guy right there. And so we just did display flex. 2 lines of code. We got a nice clean display. There we go. Okay. All right, so questions about that. This is basic HTML, CSS stuff, right? The stuff that we should already kind of know, okay? We feeling okay? All right, next up. That still doesn't quite look like a tic-tac-toe board, does it? So what do we need to do here? Forget about code, but just like conceptually, what needs to happen?
The outer border.
Yeah, we need to get rid of the outer border. Problem is, that's not really an outer border. It's really the top border of this div, the top border of that div, the top border of that div, the right border of that div, the right border of that, right? So we have to move all these borders. But because of the way we wrote our HTML, this won't be that hard. So what do this border, and this border, what do they all have in common? It's the top border. What else do they have in common?
Row 1.
They're all in row 1, right? So if I target row 1's children and turn off the top border, done. 1 line of code. So down here, let's just make a little space. And if I just target div row 1, all of their children, and we say border top none, behold, it's gone, right? So how can we slightly tweak that line of code to deal with the bottom?
Bottom of row 3.
Yep, so border bottom and row 3. There we go. Okay, so that's easy enough. Now, how about the left and right here? What do these guys have in common with each other?
All 3 rows.
First
all
child.
left.
They're the first child, yeah, exactly, the first child of each row, right? So if I target all of the rows where ID starts with row dash, that'll give me all the rows, and I target the children, just their first child, and I set border left to none. Make sense? Okay. There we go. Last one, what can we do? We can do the last child, border right. The lastest child, border right. There we go. So now we have a nice looking octothorpe for what we can use, also known as a tic-tac-toe playing field, also known as a freaking hashtag. I like octothorpe, we'll stick with that. Okay, now, a student in last class had the idea to just use like an octothorpe.
CSIS.
Yeah, in just a second. She had the idea of using an octothorpe that was just huge, like, 500 pixels or whatever, just a big. That would be super tricky to do, but I thought that was a funny and clever idea. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to do is let's see if we can make it work, like clickable, okay? All right, so in the JavaScript here, or in the HTML, I'm going to rearrange this HTML slightly so I can make it a little bit easier to manipulate. So here we go. I'm going to shrink this up just a hair. I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to change the way it's laid out, and you'll see why. All right, and so I'm going to just replace this. Where'd that go? There, and that's row 2. Does everybody agree that that's the same thing that we just had a second ago? Right? All right. So the reason I did that, though, is because I want to be able to do multi-select editing here in just a second. Now, if I want to be able to click here and have an X or an O or something appear, first of all, let's just make anything appear, right? Who cares about whose turn it is, about whether it's an X or an O, about alternating? Let's just baby steps, right? Step 1, when I click, something appears, right? That's it. That's a simple little thing to do. So what do we need to do in our HTML if we're going to pull that off?
Image?
In our HTML,
Yeah.
what would we do with an image in our HTML?
You could have an image in there and have it hidden, and then when you do a click, it'll unhide it.
Okay, so whether we use an image or just plain text, my question is, how do we make it hide or appear, right?
With the CSS.
How do we make that CSS hide or appear when I click on the tic-tac-toe board?
On click.
There we go, on click, right? That's what we're looking for, okay? So we need an on-click property, right? And we need to put a function in there, right? Some function that when I click on the div, it's going to call the function, right? So what can we call our function? All right, we'll go with play game. Since nobody came up with a cleverer name than that. Next up, let's copy this down here. All right, so now I have this play game function. So let's take a look at our JavaScript. Function, play game. So now we run into our first real snag. Normally when we want to put something in there, right, we do our old document.getElement some ID dot inner text equals, like we put an X there or something, right? Well, what ID are we trying to get here? Look at our HTML, see if we can figure that out. What ID what are we, like when I click on this one, I want an X to appear right there. If I click here, I want an X to appear there. So what are some options here?
Give them all an ID.
Okay, we could give them all an ID. That's a legitimate option. Let's try that. ID equals, we'll call it row 1, column something, right? Column 1, column 2, column 3. And then now that I have that, now what? And we would do that on all 9 of them, but what would we do now that they've all got their own IDs? Tricky, right?
Can you insert an image? Oh, this is where you would want to
Well, I'm still trying to figure out how do I even target the place where I'm going to insert the image or the whatever, right? So I want to know, when I clicked here, how does this function know that I want to manipulate this specific div?
Use an if statement and say if page, if,
If what?
with this ID.
How would you,
If they click that ID, you know, that
yeah, but how would you capture if they clicked it or not?
a function that grabs the element by ID.
Okay, but so this function right here, how does it know that I'm supposed to be grabbing the ID R1, C1 or whatever? How does it know that?
You put a number in the HTML when you use the function.
So, show me what you're saying?
So like in the parentheses.
Yes, there we go. Okay, inside of here, I want to pass in a value to the function, right? So for the first one, now, by the way, this is not the solution we're going to use, but I wanted us to see this so we can understand the idea, right? So we would pass into here R1, C1, right? And we would pass into here R1, whatever the ID is, right? R1, C3, all right? So we pass that value in. So now when this function called play game is called, we need to capture that value right here in the parentheses, right? So we'll get a variable called clicked div or something like that, whatever we want to call it. Just make up a name, right? Click div, okay? And then that will hold the ID. That's what we passed in. So that document, get element by ID, where the ID is that. That make sense? Okay, so let's run that, see if it works. So now it won't work on these down here because I didn't put any code in there, but it will work here, here, and here. Okay, make sense? Now, there's another way to do this, and I wanted this to do that way first, okay? But there's actually a more efficient way to do this. First of all, I'm glad that nobody suggested making multiple functions, right? We could have had a play game 1, play game 2, play game 3, right? That'd be a pain in the butt. But we could have done that. That's why you have parameters in your functions, so you don't have to do that, okay? All right, but let's look at another way that's a little bit easier. So let's get rid of all this. Let's get rid of all this and replace this with this. All right, we'll talk about what this means. Some of you know already. Okay, the keyword this is a JavaScript keyword, and it literally means this. Okay, in this case, this right here, the word this means this whole div, all right? In this case, it means this whole div. So what basically, you can, maybe a better keyword would be self, or me, or myself, right? The div that was clicked on, the object that we're dealing with. So this keyword is referring to the object of the moment, all right? Now, Java programmers, those who have a background in Java. If you do not have a background with Java, just turn your brain off for the next 45 seconds, all right? But if you have a background in Java, what happens when you instantiate multiple objects, and then somewhere in the original class, you want to refer to the specific object that's calling that method? Use the this keyword, right? This means the object that's in play, right? That's what they're talking about. It's the object that's in play. This is the same thing here. Okay, now everybody can turn their brains back on. Okay, this is the same thing here. This means the object in play. Well, what is the object? The object is the div that was clicked. Okay, it's the one that's being interacted with. So we pass in the keyword this. Now in our JavaScript, this clicked div is the whole div. It's not just the div's ID, it's the whole div. Which means I no longer have to say get element by ID or whatever, because I've already got the element not by its ID, but I've got it. I got the element. So all I need to do is just say clicked div. Because this is the element. Remember, when I say get element by ID, it's grabbing the whole div anyway. Well, saying clicked div here, I now have the entire ID, not the whole ID, but the whole div itself. Okay, does that make sense?
And you can change it right there.
I could do whatever I want to because I actually have the object right there, and I'm saying this object that I have, set its inner text to X. Okay? Questions about that? All right, so let's run that. Prove my theory. Everywhere I click, I get an X in that box. Okay? Now, let's just do a little bit of styling on the X's here. We'll go back to our CSS, and in those inner children, we'll go ahead and we will use text align center for that. And I'm going to use font family chiller. I just happen to know that if I use chiller and I set the font size to 175 pixels, it'll pretty much be dead center. If not, tweak it with padding or whatever you need to do to center it, right? And now when I click, there we go, okay? Looks pretty good. So now we've got a functioning game, we've done baby steps, and really with just one line of code in our JavaScript, we're able to get this game to play, okay? Or to put an X there. Now, obviously we want to alternate between X's and O's, right? So I have a solution that we're going to use, unless somebody comes up with something that I think is more efficient or something. But what do you guys think? How could we manage that? Yeah.
Maybe use a Boolean that when it's false, it's one player's turn, when it's true, it's another's.
Okay,
Then you
good.
go play game and switches.
Yep, use a Boolean value that determines if it's true, it's player one's turn, if it's false, it's player two's turn. And every time we click, we swap it back and forth. Good. It's a good idea. Any other thoughts?
Have something that counts up and divided by 2, and if it's even, it's O's turn, and it's odd.
Okay, so I have like something that counts, and if it's use modulus to figure out if it's odd or even. If it's even, it's one guy's turn. If it's odd, it's the other guy's turn. Okay, good. Any other ideas? Those are both legitimate ideas that would work just fine. Okay, those are good. I'm gonna show you a different one because it uses arrays, and I want to make sure that you guys are feeling comfortable with arrays here. So what I want to do is I want to create an array called markers or something like that for X's and O's, like take tokens or whatever you want to call it. Let's go with markers. Markers, and it has 2 values. It has an X as one value, and the other value is an O for an object. O. So I have this markers array, right? Now, just with that one thing, what could I do to line 6 to make it display an X without saying the word X there? Markers 0, yeah, right? Markers, bracket 0. That, because X is the 0th element in the array, and O is the first element in the array, right? So that's 0, that's 1. So if I run that, the program will run exactly like it did 2 seconds ago, right? X is everywhere, okay? All right. If I change that to a 1, then it's going to put O's everywhere, right? We good with that? Okay. So now this is sort of a hybrid of your 2 ideas. What I'm going to do is I want to just create a variable that I can plop in there that sometimes its value is 0, sometimes its value is 1, right? And so here's what I'll do. Create a variable called like whose turn or something like that. We'll start off at 0, okay? So now inside of markers, rather than putting a 0 or a 1, I put whose turn, which is the same thing as saying markers 0 because whose turn is 0. Does that make sense? Okay, so now if I run this game, we're just going to get X's everywhere, right? Just like before. But if I change whose turn's value to 1, now we'll get O's everywhere. Okay, so conceptually, we feel okay about that? Does that make sense? All right, now the next thing what I want to do is I need to toggle that whose turn back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, here's a cool little trick that does not work in Java, but does work in JavaScript. And this is one of my favorite things about non-typed languages like PHP and JavaScript is this feature right here, okay? It only works when you're dealing with non-typed languages. Right now, you guys are familiar with this idea. If whose turn is equal to 1, do something, right? So let's leave, this is the old school way, the Java way and the way you've already learned so far. Let's do it this way first. So what I want to do is if whose turn is equal to 1, just change it to 0. And if it's 0, change it to 1, right? Every time they click, right? Because remember, I'm only running this code here if they clicked on the div, which means they're playing the game. So the moment they click, I put the X on there or the O, and then I change the value of whose turn. So next time we click, it'll be a different value. So if whose turn, so first of all, mark the thing with an X or whatever. If whose turn is equal to 1, then we set whose turn equal to 0. Else, set whose turn equal to 1. Do we understand that logic there? Anybody lost with that? Let me know. Okay. So I'm saying if the value of whose turn is 1, set it to 0. If the value of whose turn is otherwise, if it's anything other than 1, set it to 1. So that will toggle it back and forth between 1 and 0, 1 and 0, 1 and 0. All right, so let's run it and make sure that this should go now XO or OX, I guess. Okay. Oh, that's because I set that. I want to start that at 0. Let's do that again. So XO, XO, right? That's the basic idea of what the game's supposed to be like. So let's make sure we understand what's happening here. First time through, whose turn is equal to 0? I click that box right there. Right before, I'm not going to click it just yet, but the moment I click it, this function runs, right? Because of our on-click business right here. And it passes in this, which means it passes in this whole object. So it passes that in. Clicked div now is that whole div. I'm saying, hey, that whole div you just clicked, set its inner text equal to markers whose turn. Well, whose turn is 0. So markers 0. Well, what's the 0th element in markers? It's an X. So this line of code says, hey, put an X in that thing you just clicked. Now it says, hey, is whose turn equal to 1 right now? It's not? Okay, set it equal to 1. Right? So I do that, and now I click there, and now X is marked, but now the value of whose turn is now 1, right? If we look in the console, we can see that. Whose turn? It's 1 at the moment, right? So I'm going to click right here in this top center. When I click on the top center, that's this guy right here. The play game is called. It passes in the entire div. That entire div is captured in this one variable right here. That one variable says, hey, set the inner text equal to markers whose turn. Well, whose turn is 1 at the moment. So that means markers bracket 1. Markers bracket 1, the first element is O. So that means put an O right there. And then, if whose turn is equal to 1, it is, right? Then set it equal to 0. So the moment I click this and I display whose turn will now be 0. And it's just going to keep doing that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. How do we feel about that? We good? Okay, let me show you the cool little trick that maybe I built it up more than I should have, but I love this feature. This is the same thing as equals 1. Okay? In a non-typed language, 0 is false, everything else is true. Okay? 0 is false, everything else is true. So this is basically saying, is whose turn true? Well, if it's some value other than 0, it will evaluate to true. That does not work in Java, right? If this is some value other than 0, it will evaluate to true. So in other words, if it's true, set it to 0, which is the same thing as false. Same evaluation as false, right? If I put the word false there, that won't work, because then I'd be trying to do markers bracket false, right? But this will evaluate to false. So if whose turn is true, i.e. it's any value other than 0, then set it to 0. Otherwise, set it to 1. I like that feature a lot. I use it all the time when I write non-typed code, right? So let's just run again, make sure I'm not full of it. Make sure it really still does work, right? Okay, we good? Questions so far? Okay, we have a problem now. What happens if I click on that again? I don't know what letter is about to be displayed, but check this out. I click right there. Now it goes to an X. Now an O, and now an X. That's no good, right? So we gotta deal with that problem, okay? Any thoughts on how to deal with that problem?
The text of that div, compare and.
Yep, you can, so you can do that, that's one option where I can compare, like, get the text first and see if it has an X or an O in it. If it does, then don't do anything. You can totally do that.
Return,
What's that?
that should be a return.
No, I would just have an if statement, that if it's not an X or an O, then it would just run this line of code here. Yep, what
Is
else?
there a way to do it like where, kinda like with the on-click, where you can only click it once, like, I don't know, does that sound right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is where you're heading, but this is a good solution that we're gonna actually use. That's a good one too, and actually I did that solution that Jared just suggested. I've done that many times to solve this problem as well. Until a student suggested this other solution, I thought, man, that's a lot less code, a lot less code, okay? So here's what we're gonna do. We can target any property in that div, right? Why not target its on-click property and remove the function out of there? So every time I click on a div, I immediately set its on-click property to nothing. So now the next time I click on it, there's no function to run. That make sense? So all we're gonna do is we'll just say clicked div dot on click equals nothing. That's it. So now here's what'll happen. If I refresh this, and let's take a look over here in the inspector, and the HTML right here, and so what I'm going to click on this top left right here. Watch right here what happens the moment I click. Oh, yep, we need to target that differently. This is where our little DOM property thing comes in handy, right? So we want to go into properties here, and we want to go to the properties of this, that div right there, and let's look for on click down here, and you'll see that it's set to null right here, but it's not changing to null here. So what we want to do, if we look on this one, you'll see down here on click, it just says click event, right? So it's not quite clear. I want to be able to remove that out of there. So what we can do, we go to our attributes array here, right? Inside of our attributes array, there's the on click right there. We go down to its node value. Remember this little thing that we did before with the source? So I want the node value right there. So if I right click on that, go to copy property path, now I have the node value. I want to set that equal to nothing, okay? So, right there. Why are the double quotes there? That was weird. Okay, so again, let's look at what I did there. I looked at the object that I want to manipulate, and I drilled down in the DOM right here. This is the DOM area. I drilled down, I went to div, and because I'm looking at an attribute here, right? OnClick is an attribute, it's an HTML attribute. So I look in the attributes section, and I found the attribute I wanted, OnClick, and then I looked for this very thing I'm trying to remove, this play game thing, and there it is, node value. And if I hover over it, it actually shows the value of it right there, okay? If I right click on it, it just puts it in my copy, my file path, or my copy buffer. So now, save this, refresh. Now watch over here on the right as I click, and now it removed that property there. Did you see that, how it disappeared? So when I click on this next one, you'll see them all disappear there on the right. Now what that means is I can no longer, when I click here, it says on click do nothing, right? There's nothing to do. There are better ways to do this, and I don't like leaving that hanging on click there. We'll save that for another day, right? There's also, we can add action listeners, event listeners like you do in Java, but that's more advanced, and we're gonna do that another time. This one just makes sense, and it's easy to see and wrap your head around when you're new to this stuff. So we're gonna leave it at this for now. But now I've prevented duplication here. So whenever I click on this again, this function does not run. Nothing happens, okay? All right, now if I refresh this, there's still a problem here. When I double click on that, how it highlights it, right? All these things, if I double click on them, they highlight. Don't like that. Okay, so there's a property that we can do. We've talked about this before. I'm just going to apply it to everything. It's called user select. And just set it to none. Okay. That will prevent this being able to highlight that now. So now we got a legitimate play here, and we're going to look for how to deal with the win code and all that next time.
Maybe do a player too.
Yeah, we're going to put the player names and all that in just a second, yeah. Right, but now this game functions properly, right? We just have to now manage, the proper turns and that kind of stuff, right? So any questions so far? So next up, let's deal with the players. At the top of the game here, I'm going to put right here, oops, an H2, just label tic-tac-toe. Right, and let me just style it up a hair. We'll just go, actually I'm going to give that a name. ID equals game message. Okay. So H2 game message. And we'll do font size like 60 pixels. Font family, chiller, and text align center. And we'll put a margin bottom on it, like 20 pixels. All right. Oh yeah, okay. Why isn't that centering? Yeah, this is because this is part of the body. It's actually a flex item, right? So we can actually probably just get rid of this. And what do we want to do here? Yeah, I don't want that to be part of the flex. Interesting.
Can't you remove flex or not?
Yeah, but if I remove the flex, then that breaks our tic-tac-toe grid.
Can't you remove it from a child or,
Oh, there may be a way, but I don't remember if there is. Yeah, that doesn't seem right, but I'm not sure. It's a good question. Let's see, what can I do here? Well, actually, I can put it inside the game board. Problem is then I'll be restricted to how wide the game board is. I don't like that either. Actually, no, I won't. I won't. Yeah, because of the flex. Watch this. Okay, so the game board, I'm going to put the border back on just for a minute. Border, 2 pixels, solid blue. And let me move this out for just a moment. And what happens if I put that right here? Okay, and then I can center that in just a second. But what if this is like huge text? What happens? Yeah, that's what I don't want to happen. That's what I was trying to avoid. So that still doesn't seem to work.
You could just use what you had before to center the game.
Yeah, just go back to the border. Yeah. Or,
another wrapper around the board and the flex on that instead?
I thought of that too. Yep. Yep. We could probably, let's try that. That is another solution I thought of. So just put, whoops. So the idea would be this. Does everybody understand the problem we're dealing with here? Okay. So move this out. And the idea would be that we have a div here that this becomes the flex child. So where's the bottom of this guy right here? Okay, so this div becomes the flex child. Right? So that shouldn't affect anything on the board. But then if we add right here, yeah, that should do it right there. Good. All right, so now let's change that to text align center. That should solve the problem there. And we're going to increase that font size just a hair. Center that. Man, that's just super small. Like 125. There we go. All right, now let's just test one last thing. What happens if that gets big, because when it says like Beavis's turn or something, it's gonna get a lot bigger. Still have that problem.
You have to put the flex on the div that you created.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Yep, you're right. So let's change that. So let's put the flex, all this business on body div first child. And that should do it. There we go.
The H2 is inside of that.
Yep, so let's move that out. In here. Yeah, see, all right, guess what, folks? We're gonna back up here. Yeah. This is maybe why I didn't use Flexbox in the past, because I think I did play around with that. It gets a little tricky there. So what I'm gonna do, we're gonna stop using Flexbox. Okay, so real quick, we're gonna change this. So this whole Flexbox thing, gone. We'll leave the body just the way it is, like this, and like this. And what we're gonna, let's just look at our board, it's gonna be hideous. All right, so I just want to change the width of that outer one to, width is 605, I believe was the right number. And then we'll get rid of the border. And we'll put this guy right here. Whoops. H2 ID is game message. And tic-tac-toe, the end. That should be fine, and if we have bigger text, yeah, all right, fabulous. Nice, that's on video if you want to rewatch that a couple times to see what all happened there. So let me tell you this, there's probably an easier way to deal with that flex problem. That is a problem that I have dealt with in the past, and almost every time I don't like my solution. So I'm kind of glad that came up. That's one of the tricky things to deal with Flexbox. And the reason that's interesting to think about for just a minute is because when Flexbox first came out, everybody was like, oh, it's going to replace floats. We won't need floats anymore. Just not true, right? And then when the grid comes out, or when it did come out, people are like, oh, that's going to replace Flexbox. No, we need all three of them, right? There's in fact, sometimes in your grid, you'll have a flex thing that has a float thing inside of it, right? And so all of them are valuable. So I'm glad that came up. That's cool that we had to deal with that. But now we've got the problem solved. I'm going to increase that font just a teeny bit more to, where is it? Right there. Let's go like 150. Chiller's a really small font. And so, did something weird just change? That seems like something different happened. Is there a border around it?
Yeah, there was.
Oh, I got rid of it, I guess. I don't remember getting rid of it, but okay. Anyway, yeah, so Chiller's a really small font, and so when you enlarge it, it's still not that big. All right, so here we go. We got the game going. All right, let's figure out how to say Beavis' turn, Butthead's turn, or whatever, right? You guys are going to take prompts from the users or a form. I don't want to have to, every time I refresh it, enter new usernames for the class, right? That's going to be annoying. So I'm going to hard code that, but you guys need to actually take that input, okay? So what I'm going to do, and you can still do what I'm about to do, is create a players array. And you'll just fill it from the prompt that you get, from the user's prompt. So I'm going to say players, and the first one is Beavis, and the second one is Butthead. Now what you guys will do is you'll just create so let me just copy this for just a minute. You guys will start off with something like this, right? An empty array. And then you're going to say players bracket 0 equals prompt, enter player 1, right? And that'll fill the first one, and then you'll say enter player 2, right? That's what you guys will do, something like that. You could do that by using a web form, or you could do that by using exactly what I just did there. But I don't want to have to fill those out every time we refresh here in class in the next, 10 minutes that we're going to be doing this. So I'm going to just replace that with that.
Would creating two text variables and then 0 and 1. Would that work?
Yep, you can still, so the question was, can I do something like, now, will it work or will it be allowed for the assignment? That's a different question. But what I think you're asking is this: if I have var, 1 equals Beavis, right, and var 2 equals Butthead, can I do this? Right. That's your question.
Yeah, but, so that would work, right?
That will work
But
as.
then for the assignment, just make it so those get assigned by the.
Yes, that is correct, yep. But my point is that you don't need to do that because that's just an extra step. Because whatever you're doing to assign 1 to the player value, just do it right here, right? There's no need for that. But yeah, that's a totally legitimate way to do that as well. Yep, all right. Okay, so there we go. So now, after each click, so let's just run the game, make sure we didn't break anything, right? Everything looks good. Okay. So the moment they click, I'm going to put the X, and then I'm going to swap the whose turn variable. I'm going to yank out that function so they can't click it again. Well, then I need to display a message that says it's the next guy's turn. Well, that's pretty easy, right? Because all I need to do is say clicked div, right? That's the div that was passed in. Oh, no, sorry. No. Document.getElement. And we want to target the message right here, right? So it's game message. And we want its inner text to be what? What's its inner text going to be?
Next player's turn.
Right, and so how, you're correct, how are we going to get that? Yeah, so players bracket whose turn. Because just right before this, right up here, I switched it to the next player's number, right? So it went. So if 0 just went, now it'll be 1's turn. So that's what we wanted to say, but we don't want to just say Beavis, right? We wanted to say something like it's Beavis' turn, right? Apparently I cannot spell the word turn. Right, so it says it's Beavis' turn, or Butthead's turn, right? Run, click, now it's Butthead's turn. Now it's Beavis' turn. Now it's Butthead's turn. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Questions about that? Yeah.
You make it so it starts out by saying tic-tac-toe, but then as soon as you get the prompt from the user,
Sure. Yep.
it says it's their turn.
Yeah, so what we would do, so let's put those prompts back in, because the next thing we're going to get into is the win code, and I don't want to start that today, so this would be a good thing to experiment with for a minute. So let's go back to starting with a blank players array, and we're going to say players, oh, I already, that's weird. I've got 2 of them there. I don't know why I had 2 there, that's weird. All right, so we'll do players 0 equals prompt player 1 and oops, player 2. Now the first thing, let's just do this first. What's going to happen when I refresh this? You can't see that it actually says tic-tac-toe there, right? So I'm going to just put Beavis and then Butthead. And so we'll never actually see that message tic-tac-toe. It'll immediately say Beavis' turn, right? So if we do what we were talking about. So what we'll start off with is right off the bat, we will say document.get element by ID. Now this is going to cause a problem here. What is it? Game message. And we want to set its inner text equal to, just do this whole thing right here. But we're going to run into a problem when we do that. This is the right idea, but anybody know what the problem is? Okay, this is a tricky one we haven't run into yet. Let me show you. Beavis, butthead. Still says tic-tac-toe. Okay? The reason for that, so imagine all this JavaScript right here, if I copy and pasted it right there. That's essentially what's happening behind the scenes, right? Well, this JavaScript code is running right here. One of the lines is saying, get this thing called game message. Well, it's right here in the code. Game message doesn't exist yet. Does that make sense? Game message has not been created yet. It's 3 lines later. So in other words, if I move this down to the bottom, which this we're not going to do this, but if I do this just to prove the point, Beavis, butthead. Now it says it's undefined term, which means I got to goof up in my prompt somewhere. But you see that? Let me just look here. Players. It's because I haven't defined whose turn yet, right there. So we'll put that up here. Okay, so that should work now. Beavis, butthead. Okay, it's Beavis' turn. So that works, but we don't want to just dump our JavaScript at the bottom. Now, you'll look at websites out there, you will see that. You'll see JavaScript at the bottom. It's not wrong. I'm not a fan of it. I like to keep that in the head. Okay, so there's a way around it. And we'll cover this and then we'll let it go. So we'll put this back. Does everybody understand the problem? Right? The problem is that we're trying to target something that hasn't been created just yet. It gets created 3 milliseconds later, 3 nanoseconds later, but it hasn't been created at the moment it's calling it. So what we do, we can actually put this, this piece right here into a function that we can call start game or something. And then we'll just put that, what is going on here? There we go. So now we have this function called start game. And then we, in our body, use the onload property. Onload equals start game. And so now, this line of code right here, even though, again, this theoretically is copied and pasted right here, that particular function does not run until the page loads, because we said wait till the page loads. So now, Beavis, butthead, and we got the little tic-tac-toe up there.
Go into your HTML, the onload doesn't have a quote.
Oh, yep, thanks, good catch. There we go. One more time, Beavis, butthead. There we go, okay?
Could that onload work, like could you put the prompts in that function?
Yeah, so you're asking, could I do this, right? Yeah. So the page loads, yeah, it looks the same. I see what you're asking, you want the page to display first, right? Yeah. It's loading but not displaying because those prompts are getting in the way. Now here's a weird thing about these little pop-ups. If I click away to another page and go wherever and I come back, it just assumes. And by the way, that's a pain in the butt when I'm playing your Mad Lib games and I get to the 20th noun and you have 21 nouns that you want me to enter, and then I want to look up the spelling of a word. So I go to another webpage to look up the spelling of the noun I want to use, and I come back and the whole thing has to start over. That happened a couple of times. It's not your fault. It's just the nature of the way that works if you're using prompts. So, but if you are going to use prompts, you can do all these things here. If you want it to be where you display the page first, then you're going to have to use web forms, which I think is cooler anyway. And in fact, there's a way using JavaScript where as they type their name, while they're typing it, it starts displaying in the H2 or whatever. And so you can watch as I'm typing over here, Jeff, it goes J-E and then I accidentally hit a G instead of an F or something. And it goes J-E-G, then I backspace, and then it backspaces up there. And then I put the correct letters. So it's like real-time copying what I'm typing. You can do that, yeah.
You said web form, you just need that form tag.
Yeah, just an HTML form, yeah. Okay, any other questions?